Good evening and welcome. My name is Emanuel Pastreich, and I am a professor here at Kyung University in the College of International Studies. I welcome you to the second of a series of lectures by outstanding scholars from around the world. And this lecture is brought to you by Cyber University, Kyung Cyber University, which is one of the most innovative efforts in internet education in which I have worked very closely, and also by the Asia Institute, which is a think tank dedicated to looking at issues in Asia in a more comprehensive manner. We're focusing on literature today, and particularly on the renowned writer Murakami Haruki. We have to talk about this writer and also the cultural, social, and economic context. Professor John Treat of the Department of East Asian Languages and Literatures at Yale University, who is a very distinguished scholar of Japanese literature and culture, and who will today address for us some of the more salient aspects of Murakami Haruki as a writer and as a phenomenon. We're very much looking forward to this talk. The talk will be followed by a question and answer section with Professor Treat, of course, Professor Park Sang-hyun, who is seated next to him, Vice President of Kyung Cyber University, and myself. So without further ado, let us please welcome Professor John Treat.
Thank you again, Emmanuel, for a very nice introduction. 2 days in a row. That's never happened before. I'm very happy to be here. And I have old friends at Kyung University, and now I have some new friends at Kyung Cyber University. So I'm very pleased to be here. In the present day, we cannot be sure what is a masterpiece. We don't know which writers will last and which works by those lucky authors will last. This is a very difficult thing for us to know in the present moment. It is entirely possible that we are, historically speaking, beyond the point where literature matters very much, and thus beyond the point when we will have masterpieces and great writers anymore. But of course, there are some who have been asking that question for a very long time. There is a character in a Nangai Kafu novel who insisted Japanese literature died out completely in 1897. Miyamoto Yuriko argued that World War II destroyed Japanese literature, though Oe Kenzaburo, whom in a sense World War II produced, says it was Mishima Yukio's suicide in 1970 that finally did in serious literature. It should not surprise us then that the late American literary critic Masao Miyoshi, in turn, says that Oe Kenzaburo is the last writer of merit in Japan. And he was joined in that opinion by Karatani Kojin, who wrote that, quote, in the 1980s, modern literature seems to have died once and for all. I have little doubt that 20 or 30 years from now, Murakami Haruki will bemoan the final passing of everything that made Japanese literature pure, serious, and yes, even Japanese. But today, at this moment, 2013, it is to us Murakami Haruki who is often identified as the culprit responsible for the death of modern literature, by which is usually meant literature that critiques even as it chronicles the world we live in. His novels are seen as just too pop, too American in the sense of McDonald's hamburgers and rock and roll music to have anything serious to say about Japan. Masao Miyoshi, for example, dismissed Murakami's work as, quote, sophisticated stylizations of trivia, and suggested that, quote, his breezy style discourages any attempt to figure out the plot or ponder the characters. David Pollock, another American scholar of Japanese literature, spoke of the, quote, unrelieved flatness of Murakami's postmodern language and the inability of his characters to perceive their lives, quote, in terms of either myth or history. In Japan itself, Oe Kenzaburo says that Murakami's, quote, target lies outside the sphere of jun bungaku, or pure literature. In other words, Murakami, whom Miyoshi admitted was the poet laureate of Japan in the 1980s and 1990s, is seen as the ultimate postmodern fabulist, manufacturer of a glib, highly marketable, and aggressively marketed disposable literary product representative of his degenerative cultural milieu. Murakami himself once said to an interviewer that this is the situation he and other contemporary writers face. He said that the reading of novels must compete with sports and the stereo and TV and videos and cooking and other enjoyable pastimes. But does that mean, his critics worry, and his critics are many in Japan, that the point of reading is now as trivial as those things? It was Kawabata Yasunari who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1968, where we find delicate, haiku-esque prose. Kawabata would write of the bright moon, the sound of the mountain, and the voices of the locusts. Murakami was a boy when the Kawabata novel, The Sound of the Mountain, was winning Kawabata accolades around the world. But as a teenager growing up in Japan, Murakami would listen to very different things. And I'm going to quote to you from a Murakami short story, one of his better short stories, and the title in English translation is The Girl from Ipanema, 1963-1982. Tan and tall and young and lovely. Any Americans in the audience immediately know what I'm doing. I'm singing you a song, but I'm not going to actually sing it because you would all leave. Tall and tan and young and lovely, the girl from Ipanema goes walking. When she walks, it's like a samba that swings so cool and sways so gently. How can I tell her I love her? Yes, I would give my heart gladly. But each day she walks to the sea. She looks straight ahead, not at me. This is how the girl from Ipanema looked back at the sea in 1963. And that's how she keeps looking at the sea now in 1982. She hasn't aged. Sealed in her image, she drifts through the ocean of time. If she had continued to age, she'd probably be close to 40 now, or maybe not. But at least she wouldn't have her slim figure anymore, and she wouldn't be so tan. She might retain some of her old loveliness, but she'd have 3 children, and too much sun would have damaged her skin. Inside my record, of course, she hasn't grown any older. Wrapped in the velvet of Stan Getz's tenor sax, she's as cool as ever, the ever-gently swaying girl from Ipanema. I put the record on the turntable, set the needle in the groove, and there she is. That's my quote from the Murakami short story. Now, we have to concede, and I will, that Murakami is very different from other Japanese authors that the world is familiar with. At least in the way that he is a mass event, even if mass, or perhaps I should say popular, literature is hardly anything new in the history of Japanese literature. In a sense, Oe Kenzaburo and others are right when they say Murakami and his works lie outside the older world of Mori Ogai, Natsume Soseki, and Kawabata Yasunari, where novels debated the great moral issues of the day. An example, when Murakami's best-selling novel, Norwegian Wood, came out in 1987. It's red and green covers. The English translation doesn't have a red and green cover, but the original Japanese did. Female college students in Japan would wear green and red clothes and carry the green and red book with them. These young women were called the Norway Zoku, or the Norway tribe. The novel was inseparable from the fashionability of it. And such fashionableness inspired what observers called the Murakami boom, or what the Japanese would call the Murakami Gensho. For years, Murakami has been a celebrity. His novels are everywhere, and more particularly, the special brand of nostalgia, and I'll talk about that later, associated with the logic of Japanese postmodernity, or perhaps you would like to say late model capitalism, associated, or whatever term you want to adopt to describe Japan today, as it moves into an historical stage that may no longer be modern. We may not be living in a modern age anymore. We may be living in something new that we don't have a name for yet. At the same time, however, even if Murakami's novels are devoid of the dense ideas we have seen in other Japanese writers who are translated into English and translated into Korean, that is not to say that they haven't been produced and read in their own complicated milieu. I mean, Murakami's works may be easy to read, but it's not easy to contextualize them. But I'm going to try. Murakami was born in Kyoto. Some people say he was born in Kobe. No, he was not. He was born in Kyoto in 1949. And he was raised as an only child, and some people suggest this is why so many of the male characters in his books are lonely, because Murakami himself had no other siblings. He was raised in the Kobe suburb of Ashiya by 2 parents, both of who taught Japanese literature in the public schools. It is thus either unnatural or very natural that Murakami himself claims to detest Japanese literature. Though, despite what some say, there are certainly suggestive ties between what he does in his books and what other Japanese writers did before him. Oe, for example. Murakami says that his first memory is of age 3 when he fell into a drain pipe. And indeed, if you're a fan of Murakami's, you know that light and darkness are important in his books. In school, he read Stendhal, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, all modern Japanese writers read these writers. But he also read Capote, Chandler, and Carver, who will go on to be very important influences on him. Quote, "What first attracted me to American paperback books," he has said, "was the discovery that I could read books written in a foreign language. It was such a tremendously new experience for me to be able to understand and be moved by literature written in a language acquired after childhood, i.e. English." At Waseda University, he studied classical Greek and screenwriting in the drama department. But in 1974, and for the following 7 years, he managed a well-known jazz bar in Kokubunji, a Tokyo suburb. He met his future wife, Yoko, at Waseda University, and Murakami has said that the bar, which was called Peter Cat, and his wife provided him with his own miniature world. He has always liked doing new things, regardless of what other people think, and he likes doing them alone. He's a famous marathon runner. He never did become a screenwriter because making movies means you have to work with other people, and that's something he doesn't like to do. So in 1979, while managing the bar and drinking an American beer, sitting at his kitchen table, he started to write. His early effort, his first book, was Hear the Wind Sing. Kaze no uta o kike. I'm doing the wrong side of this. Yeah. And it won him a prestigious literary prize in Japan, the Gunzo Prize. In part, critics said, because the work was so American. Not surprising. Murakami, who translates a great deal of modern American literature into Japanese, has claimed that he often first writes his novels and stories in the English language and then translates them into Japanese to give them that foreign feel. Eventually came Norwegian Wood, which is a Japanese equivalent of the American bestseller Love Story, and it made Murakami a very rich man. But before I go into his success, I want to discuss a bit with you what it meant to be a college student in the late 1960s in Japan, which Murakami was. It took Murakami 7 years to graduate from Waseda University, not because he was lazy or a poor student, but because, like universities in the United States and like universities in France, it was a time of great student unrest. Japan has had an organized left-wing student movement since the late 1910s, when the Russian Revolution abroad and domestic discord led to student activism. Student protest erupted into violence in 1960 when students and workers went to the streets to try and stop the renewal of the U.S.-Japan Joint Security Treaty. But it was 1968 and 1969 that saw the greatest university upheavals in Japan's history. The reasons were many. There was the Vietnam War, in which the Japanese government and Japanese business was seen as complicit. The coming renewal, once more, of the U.S.-Japan Joint Security Treaty, due in 1970, and the continuing occupation of Okinawa by the United States, and mounting problems within the system of Japanese higher education itself. The first major dispute occurred, in fact, at Waseda University in the winter of 1965-1966, resulting in a total student strike of over 5 months and a massive paralysis of the school. The major issue at Waseda was a proposed tuition rise, but as in other campus confrontations of the late 1960s, a variety of other issues were involved. When, in 1968 and 1969, revolts spread to Nihon University and Tokyo University, and indeed to 377 Japanese universities, riot police were mobilized to clear the Tokyo University campus, and the stakes were considerably raised until new laws and President Nixon's promise to return Okinawa effectively short-circuited and diffused the student movement's energy. Though revolutionary movements, such as the Red Army faction, continued for years afterwards. I first went to Japan in 1973 with the intent of studying the left-wing student movement. There were signs of it even then. Male students wearing helmets and their faces covered with cloth, either to hide their identities or guard against gas. They were everywhere. But by 1973, it all had an air of theater about it. The student movement was over. In hindsight, we have to say that the student movement of the late 1960s in Japan was a defeat of Murakami's generation. To some extent, the American student movement can claim credit for the American defeat in Vietnam. But the Japanese New Left would have a harder time finding any such victory. Murakami has said in an interview the following, and I quote, "When the student generation was defeated in 1970, we all changed. Before that, I believed in Marxism and in idealism and in theories. I believed that things were getting better. But after 1970, I didn't believe in any of that anymore. I no longer believed the world was getting better. After 1970, it was all gone. Everything was frozen. One big chill. It was all gone. Dreams, ideals, and everything." Well, this is, I would like to say to you tonight, is the undercurrent that one finds in a great deal of Murakami's writings. Perhaps because the author rarely expresses himself so definitely as this, however, that undercurrent is often obscured amidst the sheer fun of his stories. On the surface, his world strikes one as fantastic, surreal, abstract, postmodern, anything but politically or socially relevant. But some readers find clues to something else. When the Japanese critic Kawamoto Saburo read A Wild Sheep Chase, Hitsuji o Meguru Boken, in 1982, he thought it was an outlet for the despair felt by Murakami and his generation involved with the student movement. Kawamoto wrote, and I quote, "Reaching the part where boku is the first person singular pronoun in Japanese and is the point of view of the narrator of the novel. Reaching the part where boku goes to Hokkaido, it occurred to me that here was another person who was searching for something. In part, that was what drew me into the Murakami world. Finally, in that strange other world amidst the forests of Hokkaido, Boku meets his friend after so many years. Quietly, he asks him, 'You're already dead, aren't you?' As I read that, I found myself shedding unexpected tears." This is a highly sentimental reading of Murakami, to be sure, but Kawamoto was himself at the barricades in the late 1960s and had had his own hopes for change dashed. Quote, "From the end of the 1960s through the beginning of the 1970s, a lot of our friends really did disappear like Rat. Rat is an important character in the novel. There are times when, like Boku, I wanted to go out seeking them. I, too, wish to ask, where have all you gone?" Kawamoto wants to see Rat in A Wild Sheep Chase as a symbol of the death of 1960s student activism. But alternatively, another critic of Murakami's generation, Kato Norihiro, suggests that A Wild Sheep Chase invents a romanticized fairy tale for what that movement might have been. The novel, and I'm going to talk about it in some detail because I think A Wild Sheep Chase is his best book. Okay? If you haven't read Murakami yet, this is the novel to read. It's filled with nostalgia, and I will talk about nostalgia. However one wants to interpret A Wild Sheep Chase, the author's anxiety to present something of the atmosphere of that time, the late 1960s, is present. Murakami utilizes a variety of memory triggers, some subtle, some not so subtle, to evoke the mood of the late 1960s in his novel. Evoke is the clear word here, keyword here. He never once mentions any late 60s political event explicitly in A Wild Sheep Chase, but he does describe, we know we're in 1969, when he describes it as, quote, the time of the Doors, the Stones, the Birds, Deep Purple, and the Moody Blues. At Waseda, Murakami was never an active participant in student politics. He never joined any student organizations, nor did he assist at the barricades or even take part in a demonstration. He is a loner, and he always has been. But eventually, Murakami has written, and I quote, "Even in my class, people decided they ought to do something. Most of them wound up in darkened jazz cafes, drinking coffee, reading Oe Kenzaburo and Yoshimoto Takahaki. So I guess I was kind of an oddball. Guys who sat around listening to jazz, went to the hit movies, and played pinball all the time were not all that common. People like me were thought to be idiots, and occasionally even got beaten up for it." Murakami here portrays himself as a kind of generational outsider, a point of view that critics, such as Karatani Kojin, has seen reiterated as the transcendental consciousness which each of the narrators in Murakami's novels seem to be. This detached self has several advantages. It is privileged epistemologically, by which I mean these detached narrators can look down and see everything. And they cannot be beaten up, as perhaps Murakami was in real life, which is a colloquial way, I think, of saying defeated. Okay. let me have a... Murakami abandoned his jazz bar, Peter Cat, after nearly 8 years to sit down and write A Wild Sheep Chase, which, as I've said, was published in 1982, but the time of the novel is set in 1978. It is the story of a bored, young advertising copywriter forced by right-wing power brokers to embark on a search for a mysterious, mind-possessing sheep. This novel was his first that he wrote as a full-time writer. It won him the Noma Prize, and it was his first to have been released in translation for Western distribution. It has a sequel in Dance, 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 which is a song title taken from the American R&B group The Dells. And that was published in 1988. And in Dance, 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 the sheep man reappears from the other world to advise the protagonist, Boku, not to worry about the meaning of life, but instead just to dance, dance, dance. This is typical for Murakami. Unlike other Japanese novelists, Murakami frustratingly insists that the images in his works are not symbols and that he does not understand their meanings. They come out of his unconscious, he says, almost like automatic writing, and anyone's interpretation of them is as valid as his own. If A Wild Sheep Chase succeeds at all, he insists, it is because he himself does not understand what the sheep means. The very act of identifying a symbol and defining it, as far as Murakami is concerned, drains it of much of its potential power. He would prefer to leave it alone and let it do its work undefined in the mind of the reader. Murakami has written, for example, that most of his short stories spring from their titles. You know, most writers probably come up with the titles for their works after they've written them. But Murakami comes up with some interesting title, and then the story flows from that. A phrase spontaneously brings an image to mind, which he pursues in writing without knowing where it will lead him. He does not outline his stories and novels. Sometimes the process is a failure and he gives up, but usually the image will suggest an opening scene and then another scene and then another scene and so on. Quote, "As I write, something of which I was unaware makes itself evident to me. I find this tremendously thrilling and interesting," end quote. But it will be the point of my talk to you tonight to demonstrate that Murakami's vivid imagination is in fact very social. The product, if perhaps an idiosyncratic one, of a mass culture whose dimensions include our own here in the Republic of Korea and the United States. A Wild Sheep Chase has the fast-paced plot of a popular American detective novel. The battle lines are clearly drawn. Unlike his earlier books, in which Boku, Murakami's first-person narrator, and his friend Rat basically engage in just some lackadaisical mulling, the narrator of A Wild Sheep Chase is engaged in action almost immediately. Boku, now working in an advertising public relations firm, is dragged out of his boredom by the villain in the work, the man in black. That's what he's referred to, the man in black. In turn, the man in black represents the boss, capital B, the head of a mysterious power clique which is neither government, business, nor industry, yet somehow has the powers of all these elements at his command. Like the modern state, he is hidden, elusive, and always difficult to define. And I will quote from the novel. The person on the name card is a major right-wing figure. His name and face are almost never publicized, so he's not widely known. But you're probably the only one in our line of work who doesn't know who he is. Dumb to the world, that's me, was my feeble excuse. He's right-wing, but not the so-called right-wing. Or you could say, not even right-wing. Sorry, you're losing me. The truth of the matter is no one knows what he thinks. He has no writings to his name, doesn't make speeches in public. He never gives interviews, is never photographed. It's not even certain he's alive. The plot of A Wild Sheep Chase revolves around Boku's search for a mysterious sheep. I've told you that already. And the sheep is a semi-mythical source of great power. The sheep takes over the mind and body of an individual and uses him to achieve extraordinary power. Boku's involvement with the sheep and those intent on finding the sheep comes via Boku's old pal, Rat. In one of his rare correspondences with Boku, declining to reveal his whereabouts, Rat has included a photograph of a flock of sheep in Hokkaido, an innocent-looking picture, and had asked Boku to include it in something that would gain a lot of exposure. This Boku did in an ad campaign, soon attracting the unwanted attention of the mysterious right-wing syndicate, which makes two demands. First, the recall of the offending ad campaign, and second, to know the whereabouts of the person who sent the sheep photograph to Boku. Boku's intuitive response is to keep quiet for fear of placing his friend Rat in danger. Quote, "I will ask you one more time. Tell me by what route you obtained the photograph," the man said. "I cannot say," I said. The man heaved a sigh. "I have attempted to talk to you honestly. Therefore, I had hoped that you would talk honestly to me as well. I am not in a position to talk. If I were to talk, it might pose problems for the person who provided it." As an alternative, Boku is offered the chance to go hunting for the sheep himself, an option he accepts, realizing that he has no choice in the matter. The enemy holds all the cards. And yet, his decision to undertake this quest is prompted more out of his personal desire to do some good for Rat than out of any fear for himself or his business. He becomes, in other words, not Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple, but what is called in American popular culture a hard-boiled detective, whom one critic of that very American, and by the way, Japanese genre, described this way, quote, "Since he becomes emotionally and morally committed to some of the persons involved, or because the crime poses some basic crisis in his image of himself, the hard-boiled detective remains unfulfilled until he has taken a personal moral stance towards the criminal." Okay. Boku is concerned that Rat may be swimming in deep waters, and thus decides, as a service to his friend, to hunt down the sheep. Immediately his attitude, previously one of bored immobility, changes to one of excitement and adventure. Boku's passion for the case is necessary, but at the same time, it has to come from a personal interest rather than a professional one. In other ways, A Wild Sheep Chase has less to do with a Raymond Chandler detective novel or a Humphrey Bogart movie, and more to do with Stephen King, who is another one of the American authors Murakami translates. The girl with spectacular ears in the novel, if she appears at all, has paranormal powers. Remember, she is the one who tells Boku that he is in for an adventure that involves a sheep. Such characters do not exist in formulaic, hard-boiled detective fiction, nor, for that matter, do sheep men. Up in that lodge, the sheep man with no reflection in the mirror appears to be the link that lies between Boku and the solution to the mystery, for he provides the line of communication with Rat, providing the service of bringing Boku back together with at least a mental concoction of his long-lost friend Rat, and through him, the explication to the mystery of his encounter with the sheep and its destruction. The real problem hinges on the reliability of that solution, however, for it comes from a dead man. Quote, "I hanged myself from the beam in the kitchen," said the Rat. "The sheep man buried me next to the garage. Dying wasn't all that painful, in case you're worrying about me or anything. But I guess that really doesn't matter." When? A week before you got here. So Rat is speaking to him from the grave. It's difficult to know what to make of a mystery that ends with the specter of the victim coming back to explain how it all happened. In addition to shifting the focus from Boku's ability to reason it all out himself, Rat's supernatural appearance actually undermines the moral fantasy of the triumph of clarification over mystery, for he himself represents the mystery of death and the paranormal. The explication of the mystery, then, must be seen as ironic. One anticipation of the solution is constantly haunted by doubt as to whether Rat, the sheep man, the man in black, or the girl with the spectacular ears truly exist outside of Boku's own mind. It might all be virtual, simulated, postmodern, if you will. If capitalism today is always seeking new commodities to sell us, it does so in part through the proliferation of images, commodified signs that add up to the creation of a simulated space, a playground of sorts, in which such signs can be consumed and enjoyed, as if only to make us want to consume more. Perhaps Rat is a decadent young man who is meant to symbolize the radicalism of the 1960s. He is, after all, portrayed as an artist of sorts, certainly a writer, a drifter, and out of touch with his family. Most notably, his father, an industrialist who made most of his money manufacturing products for the Japanese military during World War II and subsequently the Korean War. Filled with ideals but never certain what to do with them, Rat is a hippie. Allied with Boku, he becomes more formidable, as does Boku, for neither of these men is so active as when the other is involved in something. Opposing them is a consortium of elusive, possibly government-sponsored power. The boss is not a head of state, nor the president of an upfront corporation, not even an industrialist like Rat's father. Rather, he is a combination of all these things. His power base built up of a combination of corporate stock and control of the media advertising industries. His power comes not from men or machinery, but from information. And in the postmodern age, information is the most valuable commodity. One subtext of Murakami's narrative, the struggle between idealism and information-based power, is not total fantasy, but Murakami's description of Japan today. Anthropologist Marilyn Ivey, an American, has written about what happens to information in postmodern societies, specifically Japan, and I quote, "In this contemporary postmodern moment, the virulence of capital has turned everything into pure commodified signs. National borders give way as information circulates in blinding speeds. Mass media, television, and advertising create hyper-real space, a space of simulation. The problem of knowledge as an informational commodity comes up repeatedly as in Japanese texts devoted to analyzing the postmodern condition." Now, a lot has been made, and legitimately so, of the Japanese/American pop images that float through Murakami's works. One interesting effect of all of this is now a kind of globalized economy of popular culture in a kind of cultural parallel to the economic practice that the Japanese call gyaku yunyu, or to import back something which you have previously exported. American readers of Murakami, Korean readers of Murakami, read about jazz and rock and roll in books that come from a country, Japan, to which those cultural practices, artifacts, were originally exported. How could it be otherwise? If you're an author in Japan today, how do you write without mentioning such global icons? Quote, "The Japanese lifestyle these readers know," writes Murakami's translator Alfred Birnbaum, "has as much to do with jeans and hamburgers as tatami mats and miso soup." The contemporary world in which Murakami sets most of his fiction is not altogether unlike the simulated space of television, for what one sees there is not only questionably real, but virtually anything can happen. In other Murakami novels, for example, pinball machines talk, people appear out of nowhere, and as you know from A Wild Sheep Chase, so do your dead friends. Still, A Wild Sheep Chase is too complicated a novel to dismiss as a vapid TV police show. If it is, for example, both postmodern and a nostalgic return to a decade just before Japan's purported postmodernity, then it creates an irony and thus shares something important and very high literary with other novels that we might read. Boku finds the sheep in the end, and on one level the mystery is solved. The boss is dead, and the man in black seems destined for the same fate, if Rat's surprise explosive bombs have their intended effect. But something else is not solved in the novel. Although Boku survives the attack, the fact does seem to remain that he has lost everything. And while some sort of minor victory has been scored against the establishment Boku is fighting, it is a victory that does him little good. Do we have here, perhaps, in A Wild Sheep Chase, a replay of the 1960s student movement, whose defeat has become something less of an historical fact and more of a postmodernist game? There may be some pleasure for the reader in the simple moral fulfillment of the story we're told in A Wild Sheep Chase, but deeper in his novel remains a lingering and, to my mind, real-world concern. Just what kind of action in the world today is efficacious? And that's the question that I would like to leave you with at the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Treat. So we will now enter the question and answer section. And I think this time the three of us will be seated together, Professor Treat, Professor Park, and myself. And we have a few questions to start out with. And then we will be, if we have time left, have a chance to hear from everybody directly. So, okay. We have a few questions to start out with. And I think that the first question is for me, I'm told. Okay. If you have met Murakami Haruki in person before, how do you feel? I'm not sure exactly what that means. And how do you think Haruki's thought, value, or his worldview are reflected well in his novels? So in fact, the only novel that I have read was the one which Professor Treat just mentioned. And as I read it now, 15 more years ago, I really am not prepared to answer meaningfully that question about what I think about his novels, except for to say that they're relatively easy to read, I thought. But I did have a chance to meet Murakami Haruki on several occasions. He spent a year at Harvard, and I spent probably more time with him than most people. So I'll just tell a little anecdote about that. There was a professor, Jay Rubin, at Harvard, who was one of the main translators for Murakami Haruki, and he called me up and he asked me to please help him on one evening in June of 1993. He needed me to help him because Murakami Haruki had arrived in Cambridge, and he had bought an enormous SUV, which was so enormous that it could not fit into the parking lot of the condominium where he was staying for the year. So this is how I met Murakami the first time. I came down there immediately. And fortunately, another professor from University of Tokyo, Oki Yasushi, was also living nearby, and his place had a large parking space. So I spent a good amount of time trying to find a parking place for him. As a person, he's both, I think, accessible and incredibly distant. So I think extremely paradoxical. Sometimes I think it's cultivated, but I'm not totally sure about that. Second question is for Professor Treat about the Nobel Prize for Literature. So I guess the question is, do you think he could be awarded it? Should he be awarded it? And what is your thought about both Murakami and about the Nobel Prize for Literature?
All right. Thank you, Emmanuel. Well, I know such things as a Nobel Prize are important in this part of the world because they're rarely awarded to Asian writers. I guess if you're asking me, do I think Murakami Haruki is one of the leading writers alive today anywhere in the world, my answer would be no. He is not. However, that's not to say he won't win the Nobel Prize, because Nobel Prizes in the past have often gone to writers that we have forgotten about. All right? Who knows what the Swedish Academy thinks? One thing you have to realize is the Nobel Prize is not a prize for literature. It's a prize for literature in translation. The people in Sweden are not reading Murakami Haruki in Japanese. They're reading him in English translation. And so writers who aren't translated, of course, never win the Nobel Prize. So we're already talking about writers who are in a kind of global circulation because they are transmitted into English or perhaps German, French, Spanish, what are considered the major languages. Okay, and he may indeed win a Nobel Prize. There seems to be the expectation that a writer this best-selling should be considered for the Nobel Prize. That's never really been a consideration of the Swedish Academy. They can pluck an obscure Polish poet out of thin air and award her the Nobel Prize, as in fact they did. I think that certain things work against Murakami. I think the fact that Japan has won 2 Nobel Prizes already. Kawabata won a Nobel Prize in the 60s. O.A. Kenzaburo won a Nobel Prize in the 1990s. Where is Korea's Nobel Prize? I think the Japanese will have to do with 2 for the time being. But I may be wrong about that. But I know the Nobel Prize matters a great deal to Murakami. He tells people he doesn't care if he wins it or not. That is not correct. He cares very much. He wants to win it. The Japanese would like him to win it, the Japanese press. But my money would bet on him never winning the prize. Or if he does win it, it will be quite some time from now.
네, 마지막 그 답변이 굉장히 재미있었는데요. 일단 그 질문을 크게 3가지로 3개를 저희가 생각을 했습니다. 하나는 사전 질문으로서 이만열 교수님이 방금 질문을 주셨고요. 네, 2번째는 제가 그 청자로서 몇 가지 질문을 드리고 그 다음에 시간을 봐서 지금 여기 오신 객석에서 오신 여러 학생님들이나 여러 학우님들의 또 질문을 받는 뭐 이런 3가지 형식인데요. 일단 첫 번째는 끝났으니까 2번째 저희가 준비한 질문을 좀 드리겠습니다. 얼마 전에 무라카미 하루키의 신작이 발표가 됐고요. 한국 독자들은 그 신작에 지금 뜨겁게 반응하고 있습니다. 그런 의미에서 오늘 교수님의 강연은 아주 시의적절했고 그렇게 날씨도 좋지 않은데 이렇게 적지 않은 청중들이 여기에 모였다고 생각됩니다. 그리고 이런 뜻깊은 강연에서 교수님께 몇 가지 질문을 드릴 수 있게 된 것을 큰 영광으로 생각하고 있는데요. 우선 첫 번째입니다. 미국에서 무라카미 하루키의 작품은 인기가 있는지요? 만약 인기가 있다면 그 이유는 무엇인지요? 하나씩 질문 드리고 답변을 듣는 그런 형식을 취하겠습니다.
Thank you very much, Professor Pak. He is very popular in the United States. He sells well. And I think that was not always the case. I met Murakami originally in 1991, more than 20 years ago, and I invited him to the United States to give a lecture, and the audience was very, very small. And I remember he spoke at Harvard around the same time, and the audience was very small. But a few years later, when he spoke at Harvard, the police had to come to control the crowds. There were so many people. So he was relatively unknown for a while. And then I think with A Wild Sheep Chase, he began to be noticed. But I think what you have to understand is that American readers look at him very differently than Japanese readers do. Japanese readers look at him as basically a kind of a Japanized American writer. And they look at him as a popular writer, and they look at him, they look towards him for entertainment. All right, they don't read Murakami for edification. American readers don't think of him as a mid-brow or low-brow writer. Americans think of him as a postmodern writer. I think they're mistaken in that. I think Murakami would like to be a postmodern writer, but he doesn't quite know how to be one. Also, American readers look to him to try and understand Japan, which is the last thing a Japanese reader would do. Western readers will always read a Korean writer for information about what Korea is really like. They will always read a Japanese reader to try and understand what Japan is really like. My advice to you is if you want to know what America is really like, do not read art writers. All right? Because writers by nature are a little crazy and not reliable informants. But there is this cognitive dissonance between Murakami in Japan, of course, and Murakami abroad, where he has been marketed as a very hip postmodern writer, and that's not how he is seen by his readers in Japan.
예, 그 방금 말씀 주신 것 중에서 그 미국 사람들이 그 일본을 좀 알기 위해서 무라카미 소설을 읽는다라는 부분 굉장히 흥미있는 부분인 것 같습니다. 왜냐하면 한국 독자가 일본을 알기 위해서 무라카미 하루키 소설을 읽는다라는 사람도 있겠습니다만 그렇게 많지 않기 때문이죠. 따라서 이 첫 번째 지금 답변 주신 것과 관련된 거를 두 번째로 질문을 드리겠습니다. 일반적으로 무라카미 하루키 작품에는 일본적인 요소 혹은 일본적 냄새가 적다라고 말해지는데요. 교수님은 어떻게 보시는지 궁금합니다. 그 두 번째는요. 보통 그 무라카미 하루키의 작품에는 일본적인 요소 혹은 일본적인 냄새가 적다, 잘 보이지 않는다라고 말을 합니다. 네, 교수님이 보시기에는 어떠신지요?
Okay, all right, okay, got it. I mentioned in my talk that Murakami is taking the American literature, the American popular culture that he grew up with, that he was fond of, jazz, rock and roll, American writers who are actually the easy ones to read, and repackaging that and sending it back out to the world. Japan is completely irrelevant to this. Japan is simply a conduit where this American popular culture is passing through and being I mean, you could take a Murakami novel and give everybody Russian names and have it take place in Moscow, and it would read perfectly well. I mean, there'd be people sit in chairs and they eat spaghetti and they eat hamburgers and you can do that in anywhere in the world. But that doesn't prevent American readers from reading Murakami, and particularly when he is at his most fantastic, when he is at his most Stephen King-like, with these paranormal things happening, and saying, oh, well, this is the mysterious East. This must be, I don't understand this, so it must be Japanese. That becomes the default explanation for his work. But I think Murakami has been very clear. He's not interested in Japan. He doesn't like to live in Japan. He doesn't like Japanese literature. He tries to write his books as if they were written in English originally. So I suppose if it helps his sales, if people think that they're learning something about Japan by reading him, he doesn't object to that. But that is not his stated goal, is to explain Japan to anyone. It was Kawabata's, aim, but this is a different generation. So no, there is nothing Japanese about his work, and that's what makes him significant, I think, in the history of modern Japanese literature, because previous writers really did have to capitalize on their being exotic to achieve an audience in the West. And Murakami is seen as postmodern, but that is different from exotic. Do you have anything you want to say?
As you're reading through the book, there really is, maybe there's a sort of a Japanese form of American style writing.
No.
Is not really.
No.
So it really
No.
literally
No.
is a translation.
No, I do not see it.
Okay.
I do not see it. It's true that his novels are formless. I mean, to the extent that they're like detective stories, there should be a strong plot. I mean, there's a mystery and it has to be solved. But he often fails to do it nicely or neatly. He will often sort of start a thread and then lose track of it. I think this is because he doesn't outline ahead of time. So I suppose some people might think, well, the formlessness of his works, well, that's Japanese. You know, that's non-Aristotelian. Okay, but I don't think so. I just think it's bad writing, and it's not an aesthetic. It's a lack of concentration in plotting his work.
예, 그 세 번째 질문 드리고 싶습니다. 예, 무라카미 하루키 작품의 한국어 번역본이 아니라 일본어 원본을 읽어보면 다음과 같은 느낌이 듭니다. 즉, 일본어 원본이 마치 영어를 번역한 것 같다는 느낌입니다. 예, 다시 말씀드리면 하루키는 자신의 작품이 영어로 번역될 것을 예상하고 작품을 쓰고 있지 않나라는 느낌을 강하게 받고 있습니다. 이에 대해 교수님은 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
It's actually similar to what you've already been talking about. But the question is, when I actually read the original in Japanese, it looks just like a translation of English. What do we make of that? That there is some sort of significance now to the fact that writing is so much just like a translation.
Well, it has to do with the added value of anything that seems Western. I mean, if an American novelist were to write his books first in Japanese and then translate them into English to give them a Japanese air, he would never be published. He would never. We don't want to read English that sounds like Japanese. We want to read English that sounds like English. Okay, but it's because of the prestige that all things Western, particularly American, have in Japan, that I think he pretends to write in English. His English is very good, but it's not that good. He's not writing these things in English, but he says that, I think. It's part of the persona that he projects. I will say this, though. The history of the translation of Western literature into Japanese, we could be talking about 19th century. We could be talking about Henry James. The Japanese, when they translate English literature into Japanese, aren't worried so much about having it sound as if it's natural Japanese. The Japanese is allowed to be a little strange to signify the fact that it was originally written in another language. So if Murakami reads a little bit like English, the audiences are accustomed, readers are accustomed to reading Japanese, which is a little strange, because so much of foreign literature, American literature, British literature, have come in to Japan in a form which would would have the reader think it's mirroring some of the idioms and structure of the original language. Am I making myself clear here? Yeah. Yeah.
For me, yes.
Okay.
Maybe I could just say one more word about that. For example, if you watch English language movies or dramas on Japanese TV, or in Korea as well, the subtitles or the dubbing will be done into a very specific form of Japanese, which is quite distant from what people actually speak in day-to-day life.
Yes, that's right.
So there's sort of like an intermediate language, which is translation English-Japanese.
Yes. I mean, for instance, he'll write something in Japanese like, kare ga kare no boshi o kabuta. Okay, he put his hat on. Well, no one in Japanese would ever say that. They would say, boshi o kabuta. It would be, but because English uses the personal preposition, my, and editors, if he has an editor, allow that because it's somehow, as the Japanese would say, kakkoi, or it's
more
stylish.
Right.
Yeah. Stylish to have for your Japanese to be international somehow.
예, 왜 사실 세 번째 방금 질문 들었냐면은, 원문을 보면은 아까도 말씀드리고 복구라는 말이 너무나 많이 나옵니다. 다시 말씀드리면 쓰지 않아도 될 곳에서도 복구가 나오는 거 보면 나라는 1인칭, 이 나오는 걸 보고 그런 걸 약간 느꼈는데요. 일단 그건 그렇고, 이제 네 번째 질문 관련된 부분을 묻고 싶습니다. 네 번째 질문입니다. 미국에서 지금 읽히고 있는 무라카미 하루키 작품은 몇십 년 후에도 여전히 미국에서 읽힐까요? 곧 그의 작품은 미국에서 고전이 될 수 있다고 보시는지요?
So do you think the books of Murakami's that are being read widely today in the United States, will people still be reading them 10, 20 years from now? Do they have the possibility of actually being a classic?
That's a good question. They'd have to remain in print, which is always an issue. I mean, books go out of print. But let's assume that that's not a factor, that these things, and on the internet, people can always find things. I would think some of it will be read. Some of his books are better than others. I think A Wild Sheep Chase is more successful than his other books. Some of them have bombed. They've bombed in Japan. What is it? South of the Border, East of the Sun. I can't even remember. I mean, some of them just don't do very well. I think it's possible that he will be read historically as representative of one, late 20th century Japanese writing, and two, as a breakthrough writer in the sense that he has joined the ranks of a global literary establishment rather than a national literary establishment, which is disappearing everywhere in the world, in fact.
예, 제가 준비한 마지막 질문, 다섯 번째 질문을 드리겠습니다. 네, 보통 무라카미 하루키 작품은 굉장히 잘 읽힌다고 합니다. 이거는 한국도 그렇고 일본도 마찬가지인데요. 교수님은 어떻게 그걸 생각하시는지요? 영역본으로 된 거를 봤을 때.
So it's just easy to read. His style seems very easy, very accessible. And in terms of the literary tradition in Japan, how would you assess this sort of stylistically?
Well, that's very true. Both Professor Pasarek and I are friends of Murakami's translator, Jay Rubin. And when Jay started to translate Murakami, and Jay Rubin is renowned as a translator of very difficult Japanese literature. He translated Natsume Soseki, he translated Akutagawa, But I asked, Ruben, well, why are you doing Murakami? Why are you translating him? And he says, because I don't need a dictionary. Okay, I don't need a dictionary. And I know exactly what he means. It's a very small vocabulary. It's often cognate with English. There's a lot of English words in it.
Right.
I find Americans that have had 2 years of Japanese can already begin to read him. And that's not true of many Japanese writers, but it's true for him.
예, 사실 그 맨 마지막 주신 말씀인데요. 한국에서 그 일본어를 가르칠 때 여러 가지 예문을 많이 씁니다. 근데 그럴 때 하루키의 예문을 자주 인용합니다. 왜냐하면 굉장히 알기 쉽기 때문에 그렇거든요. 그래서 방금 말씀 주신 거 많이 상통하는 것 같습니다. 자, 그러면은 제가 준비한 여기서 마치고요. 예, 약간 시간이 있기 때문에 객석에서 한두 분 정도 질문을 주시면은 질문을 받겠습니다. 어떻게 하게 손을 들고 질문을 주시는 지금 이 사회는 제가 진행을 하겠습니다. 제일 먼저 손을 들어주신 세 번째 줄에 계신 분 부탁드리겠습니다. 통역이 될 겁니다.
저는 양을 쫓는 모험들이나 바람의 노래를 들어라 같은 초기작보다는 해변의 카프카나 하드보일드 원더랜드와 세계 끝과 하드보일드 원더랜드라는 후기작을 더 많이 재밌게 읽었었는데요. 복구라는 말, 그러니까 1인칭 말이 굉장히 자주 초기작에서는 보였는데 최초로 신을 쫓는 아이들이라는 작품에서 그가 3인칭을 쓰기 시작하잖아요. 또 굉장히 전공투 세대에서도 아웃사이더라고 말했던 무라카미 하루키가 고베 대지진과 옴진리교 사건을 굉장히 진지하게 다루는 것에 대해서 그의 문학관이 변한 건지 아니면 그의 무의식 체계가 자연스럽게 흐르고 있었는데 그게 뒤늦게 발견된 건지에 대한 질문을 드리고 싶습니다.
About his style and she says she likes his later works like Hard-Boiled Wonder World, and specifically the way. But I can't. 제가 미안해요. 제가 잘 이해 못했어요 그걸.
저 그러면요.
네.
방금 질문 주신 거를 간단하게 짧게 다시 한번 주시는 건 어떨까요?
About the third
그가
person.
전공투 세대를 겪었음에도 전공투 세대로서 스스로 아웃사이더라고 말할 정도로 사회에 관심이 없던 사람이었는데 최초로 3인칭을 쓰기 시작하고 옴진리교 사건이나 고베 대지진 같은 큰 일본의 역사적인 사건에 대해서 관심을 가진 것에 대해서 그가 그 사건을 겪으면서 변화한 건지 아니면 전혀 변화하지 않은 것인지에 대해서 궁금합니다.
그러면 우리는 그 작품 안 읽었어요. 저 잘 몰라요. I've never read these books, so I don't actually know the details. So I think he's.
Well, I'm glad you like his work. He works very hard. The style that I'm familiar with in his works is what we would call, I guess we would call it impersonal third person. In other words, some of his short stories will be written in the first person narrative, but there's no difference really between his first person narrative and the third person narrative, because the third person and the first person have the same access to information. I don't consider him a stylist. I mean, I think the stories are told the way Raymond Carver tells his stories, the way that Tim O'Brien, who's another one of his favorite writers, there's nothing clever about the way he writes. I recently read an American novel, which I'm very fond of, that's narrated in the first person plural. If you think about it, that's very hard to do. But he hasn't attempted anything as complicated as that. The stories have to be, there has to be a direct connection between his narrator and the reader. I think it's very important that there be a kind of easy identification. One extremely intelligent American said to me once that he was fond of Murakami Haruki because Murakami sees the world exactly the way he does. Well, okay, that's fine. I don't see the world the way Murakami sees it, but the fact that someone could see the world the way Murakami does means that Murakami's narrator is easily assimilated to the point of view of the reader. And I think that's a very successful hallmark in his writing. I'm not in a position to address the question of how his style has changed over the years. I'm very aware of how his subject matter has varied. He's attempted to become a serious writer. You know, in Japan he was criticized for being light, and so he decided to get serious and write about World War II. It didn't go very well. So he doesn't do that anymore, and he's back to writing works like the current one, the new one, which don't really engage with history with a capital H, but in fact are the stories of some very particular people, and the absurd and dull encounters that they have in everyday life.
예, 그 시간 관계상 한 분만 더 질문을 받겠습니다. 예, 저 맨 이쪽에서 왼쪽에 맨 뒤쪽에 계신 분이 있는데.
하루키를 좋아하시는 분들도 있지만 제 주변에서는 이제 싫어하시는 분들도 있거든요. 왜 그러냐면은 그 하루키가 다루고 있는 그 섹슈얼한 이미지가 부담스럽다고 느끼시는 분들이 있는데, 이제 교수님 생각에는 그 하루키가 그 섹슈얼한 이미지를 적재적소에 제대로 쓰고 있는지 그거를 먼저 얘기해 주셨으면 좋겠고, 그리고 미국 독자들은 그런 거에 대해서 어떻게 생각하는지.
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. In particular, the novel before the current one, Ichikyu Hachiyon, 1Q84, had some explicit sex in it, and it disturbed readers. And in fact, in one of his earlier novels, there's some lesbian sex, which is described. And school libraries in the United States won't allow that book. But I have to say that Japanese literature in general has a lot of sex in it. And there are many Japanese novels that aren't allowed in American school libraries. I just think Murakami has trouble with women. I'm surprised that women can be fans of his writing because they don't seem to come off very well. I'm not saying that he's a misogynist or anything like that, but I just think that with a couple of short stories aside, there are some short stories of his where the women are wonderful, but generally the women don't come off very well in his works, and I don't know why. He's not the only writer like that. It's often hard to write from the point of view of the other gender, and that might be his problem. But I found the sex in 1Q84 a little disturbing myself, and I am not a puritanical reader. I am not a conservative reader. I found it unnecessary. I found some of the description of heterosexual intercourse in the novel prurient. I didn't see how it served the story any. And others have made that criticism of him. I am not the only one.
예, 그러면은 저희가 준비된 시간이 이제 거의 다 다가왔기 때문에요. 일단은 여기서 마치겠습니다. 오늘 그 시간을 내주셔서 강연을 해주신 교수님하고 그다음에 대담을 해주신 이만열 교수님께 진심으로 감사드리고요. 한번 박수 한번 쳐주시면 어떨까요?